finally talk to you. So now we're recording. So my name is Tonya Hegamin, and today we're going to be talking about something that's, interesting to me as not only an African-American historical literary scholar, but also as a type 1 diabetic. And, I started having this conversation of passing and masking in disabilities it's been happening for a long time. There was a conversation with some other folks that I had with other disabilities, especially people who use mobility aids. Let's say like I need, one day I might need to use my cane, but the next day I might not. And what does that sort of represent? And how are we sort of recognizing the history of making choices, making distinctive choices about when, where, and how to reveal our disability or reveal the needs that we have. So that's just a fascinating sort of place for me. And, here's a bunch of things about me, but you can read that later. Or you can go to my website, tonyacherihegamin.com. So we're going to talk a little bit about, we're going to start out talking about silence and invisibility as a means of surviving oppression and gaining social privilege, which is, what passing is truly about. And then we're going to talk about the differences between passing and masking in historical and literary contexts. We're going to talk about internalized ableism, and we're going to have a lot of discussion questions about how do we use passing or masking as people with diabetes. So historically and genealogically, the term passing has referred to mixed race or biracial Americans identifying as or being perceived as belonging to a different racial group. Edmund Kenney, a biracial person, was able to pass for white in the United States as early as the 1800s. And there's also a very interesting story that I was just researching about a very young woman who was of African and Native Cree descent, who found oil on the land that her father who was Native, willed to her. She became one of the first multimillionaires in American history. And interestingly enough, I know this is a sidebar, but interestingly enough, the government granted her white status because she could not use her money, all of her millions, unless she was labeled white. So there's so many layers of social, economic issues that come in with passing, right? Or of being labeled African or African-American or white for that matter. And all of it is kind of made up, right? It's a social construct. It's not an actual, thing about us that makes us different. It's just a social construct. Tina Giannula says, for light-skinned African-Americans during times of slavery and the intense periods of racial resegregation that followed, passing for white was a survival tool that allowed them to gain education and employment that would have been denied them had they been recognized as colored people. The term passing has since been expanded to include other ethnicities and identity categories. Discriminated groups in North America and Europe may modify their accents, word choices, manner of dress, grooming habits, and even names to appear to be members of a majority group or a privileged minority group. Now, I also have personal experience not with passing, but passing. My great-grandfather and my grandfather would pass for white so that they could work better jobs, they could get more money. Where my great-grandmother and her daughters, who were darker skinned, would work as domestic workers. So I've seen all of this sort of happen in real time. And so it's fascinating to me just in terms of race, but we're going to get into more about how this sort of mirrors disability, and especially an invisible disability like type 1 or type 2 diabetes or MODY or any of the other types of diabetes. So some of you might have read this poem, which is one of Paul Laurence Dunbar's first and most popular poems. And usually this is a poem that young people learn, and we kind of think about it, but we don't think about it. So listen while I read it and think about how it might apply to you and your experience. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile, with torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but O great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet and along the mile. But let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask. So in the chat, if you guys are interested, give me some feedback on how that poem kind of relates to you in your, and does it relate to you? Does it resonate with you at all? What about it resonates to you? I'm interested in hearing what everybody thinks about it and how it might relate to them with their diabetes. So I'm going to keep going, but we'll come back to the chat to, sort of get some responses. So, obviously, the poem was talking about someone putting on another face for another particular situation. Lies for when one needs to pretend to be something that they aren't, and grins for getting by in uncomfortable situations. Obviously, if you know a little bit of African-American history, you know how, where, and why this resonates for African-Americans, especially in 1895. But it continues even, to this very day, right? Like I don't know, some of you might have seen during the storm a couple of weeks ago, there was a reporter who was, doing his job and reporting at the beach, and a white person came up and got in his face and was threatening him. And people's response about how the Black reporter acted was, oh, he had such dignity, and oh, there was no space for him to be a human and be mad back, right? To be able to show how he's really feeling, which I'm sure was anger, fear, anxiety, all of the things that any of us might feel if someone comes up to us and treats us badly. And the reason why we cannot show our true feelings is because we know that we will be judged more harshly and differently than a white person would. So when Paul Laurence Dunbar asks why the world be overwise in its counting of all of our tears and sighs, although this is a very serious question, it's clear that he finds something ironic about it, that the clear emotional expression that's used here is representing some of the deepest societal problems that we have, that, those who are allowed to, be upset, allowed to be whoever they want to be, versus those of us who have to wear a mask. Now, I'm not seeing any responses in the chat, but I'm going to talk about my own experience of masking and how I see it being reflected as a person with diabetes. So I think of masking as like, let's say I go on a first date with someone and I don't check my blood sugar until I go to the bathroom. Or I only give myself a dosage of insulin away from that person. That's masking, right? Where we're not comfortable or ready to show our true selves in that moment. Now, masking can kind of be, a double-edged sword, because what if something were to happen? Let's say you had a super low after dinner and that person did not know that you were type 1 diabetic. That mask is where, you end up being hurt by not sharing or not being open and honest about your condition or your needs. So I don't know, has anybody had an experience like that where they've, not told people because of a situation? I know I definitely was masking at work for a long time when I first was diagnosed with diabetes. People might know that I had diabetes, but like if I was in a meeting, I wouldn't, let's say I wouldn't want to leave the room in case something happened. So I would be trying to like check my sugar, manually under the table, or I would just leave it until, at the end of the meeting and then find out that I was probably in trouble at that point. So there's, one of these things about masking is that we often end up hiding ourselves. And especially as people of color, we're already at a position of feeling like we cannot be our true selves in public or with every person. And so, we're sort of living this double-edged sword, or what W.E.B. Du Bois would call double consciousness, sort of living not only as a person of color or as an African-American, but also living as this American, in this American white world, where you have to be overly vigilant about not only being how the world perceives you, but also how your perception through others could possibly harm you or put you in a vulnerable position or embarrass yourself and other people. So I want you guys to really think about, I know there's a lot of, we're talking about a lot, and I'm kind of moving fast because I want to get through everything, but, please feel free to, answer any of these questions in the chat, or unmute yourself, or raise your hand or unmute yourself, and maybe, we can get some Q&A afterwards.
Hey, Tonya, I wanted to interject if that's okay, because I know
absolutely.
you really wanted this session for people to give you a lot of feedback. I know for me, and I have prediabetes, so hopefully someone that identifies as type 1, type 2, or other diabetes can chime in as well. But when you were reading the poem and just kind of thinking about some of the things that I've experienced as a woman of color, I feel like I wear so many masks at times to where it's almost like I don't, if I wasn't more in tune with myself and more self-aware, I would know which was the real me. And so, we're talking about, you've shared what we've heard from so many of our presenters and moderators this week about like having to go to the bathroom and hide. That's one of our speakers is from the Indian culture, and she had talked about that. But we wear masks in more than ways than one. I think about Robin Williams, how he committed suicide, but every time you saw, he was a funny man, right? He made everybody laugh, and he was so sad inside. That's a mask that we wear. We don't want to come across as depressed. We don't want to come across as too black. We don't want to come across as unhealthy. And when we have diabetes, especially if we're on the fluffier side, then people have a certain stigma, or they have their comments about that. So it's not just one mask, it's layers. It's layers of mask. I think that especially people of color living with diabetes have to deal with. So thank you for bringing this up today.
Thank you. Well, I think one of the things that you said, which is really important for us to sort of remember in terms of differentiating these two terms and why it's important to differentiate between them, is that just what you said, that there are so many masks, and there, one, as soon as one comes off, another comes on often. And sometimes we're not even clear about it. We're just putting on the face. And often we're thinking of other people's feelings before our own needs, right? And that is incredibly important to differentiate and to discern for oneself. And especially when you first come out as a diabetic, right? There is so much unsolicited information that people want to give you. and you get, you get very quickly tired of it, and you just don't want to have to reveal yourself in order to, just be able to be quote unquote normal, or to be, to just have an experience rather than having to have an experience on top of, all of these layers of grins and lies and tears and sighs. So we're going to move on, and I'm going to talk about the book Passing by Nella Larson. This was a novella in 1929, and this book helped to establish the term passing after several years of prior use. So it was used colloquially, but people never really sort of thought of it as a terminology, or that people were even living a way of life, right? That people were living an entire life as a different race. The writer and subject of the novella is a mixed race African-American Caucasian who passes for white. The novel was written during the Harlem Renaissance, when passing was commonly found in both reality and fiction. Since the civil rights movement of the 1960s, racial pride decreased the weight given to passing as an important issue for Black Americans, but it is still possible and common for biracial people to pass based on appearance or by hiding or omitting their background. And if, I'm sorry, I totally spoil the end of the story, the passing person dies at the end of the book. And that's important because the author is sort of like giving a judgment on this woman who lives her life in a full denial of her racial heritage. It's a very fascinating book if you ever have the chance, and really all of this is for me to like give people more books to read. That's, as an English professor, that's really all I want, is for people to read more books. But this novel is incredibly telling because of the struggle that, so there's two women who are featured in the book. One woman who passes basically through masking, right? They meet they were childhood friends. They meet again at a New York restaurant where both of them are masking in order to go to a white restaurant. And so they see each other, and we call that clocking now, right? In the queer community, we would say, especially with trans people, oh, I clocked that person. I recognized them for who they really were when they were trying to hide themselves or just trying to, not be noticed. So when these two women meet, the woman who is masking, who lives in an African-American community, is married to an African-American man, and only uses her light-skinned race privilege to get into certain spaces, versus the other woman who has completely denied her heritage, is married to a white man, has children with a white man, and the white man has no idea that she is actually Black. So we see these two sort of, representations side by side. And yes, Imitation of Life, perfect, right? So Imitation of Life was actually based partially on this book. So I love it when we can talk, cultural histories and movies and books and how they intersect and follow and replicate each other. So, passing is different than masking because passing requires that like full on, like, I am just, I'm denying, this of who I am, and I'm living completely as a different person. And like I said, I have, not ancestors, but my great grandfather did pass for white. And, that passing would be considered passing because he, in his work life, lived completely as a white person and then lived a whole other life, right? So passing is about, like, let's say for a diabetic, passing would be to never let anybody know that you were diabetic. And this has happened. This still happens, right? There are tons of people out there who are in denial of diagnosis, who are in denial of treatment, or who just don't want to have anybody else in their business. One of the first people to be to use insulin, she kept it from her whole family. No one knew, because back then it was just, you don't tell anybody about it. You don't talk about it. It's like, you know, how cancer used to be. They would say the C word rather than actually say cancer. And a lot of this has to do with, just like in this novel Passing, it's not just about like wanting to live in, you know, in denial of who you are, but the importance of being a part of the larger community becomes more important. You know, your socioeconomic status might be impacted by this, because let's say you wouldn't get a job if you know, let people know that you were type 1 diabetic and that you needed to have breaks, you know, every hour, or you needed to, you know, have a time in between, you know, lunch and your next shift to recover from lows and highs. So we have a comment in the chat. This is Jocelyn again. Thank you, Jocelyn, for your comments. Passing is so interesting to me because as a light-skinned femme presenting woman, I pass in a lot of ways in my life. This is so important for us to have this conversation. Thank you for revealing. When I tell people that I'm a second year of medical school, and based on the way I present, my hair is wavy but straight. There are settings where my chronic depressions, ADHD, ethnicity as half Black, half white, and my identity as a bisexual woman doesn't come up. Yes, sister, I'm feeling all of your vibes. When is it responsibility to identify ourselves in our communities? I love this question. Now, this really is like the hinge of Passing, right? This question of responsibility. Because in the book Passing, there is a section where the woman who's sort of judging the other woman for living completely as a white person, she's speaking to her Black husband, and she's sort of like, I don't understand how she could do this. What about, you know, the movement, the people, you know, the race, because, you know, it was so important to her to have this, you know, and they were middle-class Black people living in, you know, 1920s Harlem. So it was so important for her to do the church work that she did, to do the volunteer work. It was important for her status to be working for the race, that she could not understand how this other woman would turn away from the race in order to have a white life. So this idea of what is your responsibility is constantly being brought up. Now, even with masking, right? Let's say we just talked about, you know, masking or not telling someone because you don't want to deal with, you know, in that moment, you don't want to necessarily reveal yourself, or you don't want to deal with what you think might happen, you know, if you do mask. There's that responsibility then passes back to ourselves, because we could be creating problems, right? Like not creating problems, but you know, if let's say I'm in a meeting and I pass out and nobody knows that I'm type 1, like I could truly be, you know, in for some horrors. But, you know, responsibility in Passing is also about, you know, one's psychological ability to deal with all of these things. Like you were just saying, you know, we're much more used to being complicated now than we were before in the past. I'm talking about historically, right? Like I can tell you that, you know, I've lived in Brooklyn. I could walk up to any person at any part of Brooklyn and say, hi, I'm gay and I have a disability. And they'd be like, meet the next person who has that, you know, or this person who has this other thing, right? Because our identities have become paramount, right? We live in a much more individualistic society. So our responsibility to others is really about identifying ourselves for ourselves, so that because we have the idea that showing up as authentic means to have a very clear, open, and honest identity. But we're also really recognizing now that identity is also, it's almost as fluid as gender, right? gender is, sort of a thing it's another social construct, just like race. And so when we start seeing through the spaces in which, our responsibility is less about, other people and more to ourselves, then I think that we have moved beyond the passing of the past. I guess you could say that way. Passing that happens now is often more based on that socioeconomic, sort of level of like, if I tell people that I'm diabetic, I can't get a job. If I tell this person that, I'm diabetic, they'll tell me how gross they think it is, right? And how, the trauma that we sort of anticipate. So, speaking about responsibility, that sort of goes then into this internalized ableism, right? Because this person in passing is sort of internalizing their racism by turning away from who they truly are. So internalized ableism is so important to recognize, because we often, I know, especially as diabetics, we tell other diabetics what we think they should be doing because it works for us. We might berate ourselves for, your pump breaks, or you ate too much, you ate too little, and you think that, you're a bad person. That internalized ableism, I just wrote a Instagram post about fat phobia and ableism, and how, those are very inextricably linked in terms of diabetes, because the outside world, and not we, but the outside world sort of equates diabetes with being unhealthy, with being fat. And fat, is actually, fatness, or the notion of fatness and bodies and being unworthy when they are fat is also a racist notion that sort of was set about to dehumanize Black women specifically. And if you're interested in that, you can look up, there's some, I put in my handout a book called Fearing the Black Body, which talks about how fat phobia is definitely raced in anti-Blackness. And there's a couple of other books that are out this year about that same topic. So, when we internalize ableism or fat phobia or racism, we start to eat away at ourselves, right? We have to make a choice between our personal survival, or our perceived personal survival, versus, the convenience of invisibility or normalcy. So it is very important for us to sort of examine, and not sort of, I mean this, and one of the reasons why I wanted to do this talk was to really examine my own internalized ableism and internalized racism, and how do those things sort of mesh together? Do they discount each other, or do they amplify each other? So if any of you are interested, please put in the chat your thoughts around this, or questions. If you have questions for me too, if there's anything that I'm saying that you're like, wait a minute, where are you going, lady? Please put them into the chat. If there are no questions right now, I'm going to move on, and we'll come back to this idea of responsibility in just a second. So the next book, cultural history, that we're going to look at is Lakestown Rebellion, which is a novel by Kristen Hunter. Now, this book is significant because I'll go on reading it. It's set in a historically Black town in New Jersey in the early 1970s that was secretly sold to the state in order to make room for a new highway. So we would call that now gentrification, right? So it's a story about gentrification. And this author, she did a lot of work on gentrification and the displacement of Black people in rural and city urban areas. So one of the main characters of this book, and this is an early book by Kristen Hunter, One of the main characters, his name is Fess, and he's a type 1 diabetic who has a close relationship with his Black doctor. Fess is integral to organizing the community to rise up against the state. And this is one of the first representatives of Black type 1 diabetics in literary history. If anybody else knows of any other representations of type 1s or type 2 diabetics in African-American literature, please let me know, because this is something that I'm highly interested in. And I'm highly interested in it because I wanted to see how this author represented us back in, the early 70s. How are we represented? We're going to read an excerpt in just a second, but before the excerpt happens, it's very interesting how she portrays, this character. So before the excerpt that we're going to talk about, which is between Fess, this type 1 character, and his doctor, he goes and he buys and eats a souse sandwich. A souse sandwich is a pork sandwich, a fish sandwich, fried fish sandwich, and a barbecue ribs and several beers. And later in the conversation, his doctor tells him, "Grease is what keeps our race going. I would never be cruel enough to put anyone on a low-fat diet unless they were white." So this was an interesting quote to me because I don't know if any of you follow nutritionists. I love following nutritionists who are talking about alternative means of nutritional healing, right? The intuitive eaters, the Black nutritionists, the Asian nutritionists. And there's a conversation that's been happening around Black nutritionists around how people of color are very afraid and reluctant to follow the quote unquote healthy diet because it equals white food to them, meaning it means bland food. It means, boiled chicken. It means, nothing of, the grease, right? That what this doctor is saying is keeping our race going. And that's something that I think is very important for us as type 1 diabetics and type 2 diabetics to talk about. Isn't it okay for us to eat the food that we want to eat, the food that connects us to our history and our culture, and also find ways of doing low-fat diets? This is funny to me because in the 1970s, there was no such thing as a low-fat diet. Like now we think of low-fat diets as like, oh, it's a thing that, people do. But back then it wasn't really a thing except for something that was truly for a diabetic, right? Or someone who had a specific health issue. And I feel like, this is a part of this idea of, passing and masking. Are we masking ourselves by not eating the foods that we want to eat, or by not, celebrating our culture in the ways that we want to celebrate because of this whole thing around diabetes and what we should and shouldn't be, or should and shouldn't have? So I wanted to pose the question, do interactions between Black doctors and patients change the discussion about race and ability? So I don't know how many of you as people of color or non-people of color have had Black doctors. Yes, vegan Black queen fabulousness, Tabitha Brown, she is amazing. Thank you, Jocelyn, again. So I did have a Black doctor, and I sought one out. It was very important to me that I found a Black endocrinologist when I moved back to New York, because I was like, where else would I be able to find a Black endocrinologist if it's not in New York City? And unfortunately, he was of the mindset that that a lot of, and he was a senior person, not that he was a senior citizen, but that he was a senior doctor, that he was one of the older doctors who had been working with endocrinology for a long time. But when I asked him about accommodations for work, he was like, why would you need an accommodation? And I was like, well, I stand up, I lecture all the time. Sometimes I have low sugar in the middle of lecturing. I don't know that I have it. And, I could pass out, or, all of the things, that we need, that now that I have. And he was very much against me asking for accommodations. And he said, well, you don't want them to think you're lazy. And that, whoo, friends, if that wasn't a trigger response to me, whoo, I don't know if any of you got just triggered from me telling you that. But, it was this ideology around that went into, again, internalized racism, internalized ableism, right? This ideology of the capitalist system being more important than our own health and our own needs. Now, he was essentially asking me to pass. And I could not accept that, because to me, it was more important. And again, we're talking about responsibility. I felt it was more important, and that I had a responsibility to let my students and colleagues know that a potential emergency could arise in my life, at any time, and that they should know what I needed. That, if something I needed to let, certain people know, if this happens, do this. I need some of my students to know, if this happens, go, in my bag is is gummy bears, go get them. And for me, the responsibility, again, was about me being responsible for myself and my own health, and to be responsible to the others who are around me, so that they were not traumatized by my health event. So I pulled this little section here just to read a little bit, to get this interaction between these two men that this author, again, this is not a factual interpretation. It's very fictional. So when Fess, our main character who has type 1, after he goes to the doctor having eaten the pork sandwich, the fish sandwich, and all the things, and the author is actually quite smart, and she talks about how he has a conversation when he orders all this food, when people are like, well, where are you putting all of this food? You're so skinny, you're so thin. So she had some consciousness around what type 1 diabetes was. And I do actually think that she was a diabetic herself, but lived kind of in a space of passing or masking. I do not have actual information about that, but there are other things that in my research about this author that I'm finding that lead me to believe that is true. So they've just taken some of his tests, his blood tests. And remember, back in the 1970s, you didn't have a device to just prick your finger and take, and find out your blood sugar. You had to have an actual blood test. You had to, use urine. You had to have like a science kit, right, for this. So Fess the only time he ever gets his sugar checked is when he goes to the doctor once a week. So he and the doctor have a very close relationship, and they're talking about the gentrification that's happening in this town. And so it's very interesting because they relate the story of type 1 diabetes to, the doctor relates it to a baby that is born with hermaphroditism. And he tells the parents, and this is at the beginning, he says, sex is often rather distinct in nature. Isn't it the last thing to develop in the human embryo? Did you know that? The other night, I delivered an infant with both sets of reproductive organs. Good God, what did you tell the parents? The doctor chuckled. I just told them to wait a while before naming the baby. It'll take a little time, a few tests, till we know which sex is dominant. Then I'll order a minor operation and they can start buying pink or blue booties. Hermaphroditism is fairly common, and it is not really a serious problem, not anymore, as long as the infant is normal and healthy in all other respects, and this one was. While talking, the doctor had listened to Fess's chest, thumped his back, and tightened a cuff around his arm. And he said, good, after getting the second reading. So then Fess says, I'll live. The doctor says, technically, Roni, as I've told you before, you've been dead for 15 years because of his type 1 diabetes. You're a moving miracle, like these butterflies. But I believe in miracles, and I see them every day, at the least, and at least your pressure is under control. He pointed to the little bathroom door at one side of the cluttered room. You know the rest of the routine, might as well get over with. Fess, who was feeling pressure in his bladder from the beers, went gladly to the little cubicle and produced a urine sample. Next, he coughed up sputum into the waiting cup, and last, since he was thoroughly accustomed to using a hypodermic to inject himself with insulin, he drew his own blood sample with the needle Doc had provided. He brought all 3 containers back to the doctor, who was breaking the seal on a more attractive bottle. I've just discovered this. And then he tells him about, this alcohol that he has. And Fess says, well, what about my blood sugar? And the doctor says, well, you've already given me your sample, haven't you? And Fess nods and joins him in laughing. And they continue to drink and talk merrily. Now, there's some really interesting things that are happening in this one page, right? And it's so, like, again, I feel like this author has so much interesting foresight about, medical issues that were just not really talked about in plain company. Sex and gender of the human embryo, and then relating that to type 1 diabetes. And this is going to be interesting as we talk about the next book, which also relates being queer and being type 1 diabetic. So let's go to that, because I know our time is moving on because I talk a lot. So the next book we're going to be talking about is The Quandar Quality, which is a book about he was probably one of the first Black children to receive insulin. And he was from one of the first free Black families in Washington, D.C. And in his book, what's very interesting is that he says that he does not speak about his diabetes diagnosis, even with his wife. And he calls it the big secret. And he compares it to coming out of the closet and having AIDS. So, we're kind of constantly asking this question: how does keeping T1D or T2D help a secret that helps and or hurts? And what is the difference between coming in and coming out? So coming in is a new reference that is being sort of used by people who are not interested in like coming out as though they have to tell everybody that they're queer, that everybody's got to know. Coming in means I invite you to know me, right? And this is where we sort of are, sort of seeing where passing and masking can connect with sort of queer studies. So inviting someone to know you, inviting someone to know your health history or your disability versus, like constantly shouting it, is a personal decision that people make. And in his, I'm sorry, I'm just going to go back for 1 second. In his book where Quandar talks about coming in and he talks about coming out of the closet. Again, this was in the 1980s where, a lot of these things weren't talked about. And he was a deacon in the Catholic Church. So he had all of this empathy for people who had AIDS and people who were coming out of the closet, because he understood what it was like to live passing. And he understood the discomfort and the disingenuousness, it wasn't about disingenuousness. Let me rephrase that. Just the not being able to be fully in yourself, right? That you are constantly looking to society to approve of you or to get your position. So I'm sorry I did not leave enough time for talks and Q&A. Oh wait, we still have about 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah, we could take a couple of questions.
Okay. Maybe people, maybe people just want to unmute themselves, and we'll, whoops, I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, you close it. Thank you. So does anybody want to unmute and ask a question? You can raise your hand or just unmute yourself. What are your thoughts on passing? Has anybody, like, even not meaning to, passed or masked themselves? No, nobody ever? Wow. I know, it is for me a conscious decision. And sometimes it's an unconscious decision. It just sort of happens, right?
Well,
Go.
I
Oh,
will.
please, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Dora.
Hi.
Thank you for your presentation, by the way. It was very enlightening. But I will say that, like at work, a lot of times, often we put on masks depending on who we're interacting with. And I know personally, I also dress the part because I find that if I dress not the part, then I'm sometimes confused for another section of where the workers. So I'm an office worker, and we also have manufacturing. I get sometimes mistaken for manufacturing if I don't dress the part or don't carry myself a certain way. And during the pandemic, it was interesting to see kind of a clash of the work mask and that existing at home with the family. That didn't go very well.
Yeah.
It was kind of shocking for my husband to hear me and present in a certain way.
Yes. And isn't that is, I think you really said it, because often, especially when we're, people of color, we're wearing so many different layers, like that it's shocking to people outside of us or outside of that space to like see it happen. I just had a conversation with a colleague because I've started, I'm showing my face here now because I want to be, but I've started refusing to show my face during department meetings. And I don't feel like I need to have my students see my face all of the time, simply because as a woman of color, and I'm teaching to other people of color, and I'm working in an institution that's predominantly Black. I feel like there's so much that we have to do to present, right? Like you're saying, to not be mistaken for something else, to not be put into another, realm of marginalization, right? You want to kind of center yourself a little bit more, to make yourself accessible sometimes. And that is a very hard thing to sometimes just admit and to recognize and to have conversations about with the people around you. So Dora, did you and your husband have a long conversation about it, or did you kind of like leave it?
We had a conversation about it, and it's funny because after we did, I noticed that there was a lot of articles coming out in the news about just that and how we weren't alone. There was a lot of people who were kind of coming to that realization.
Yes. And did you feel it was easier or harder to sort of pass or mask at home versus work? You said it was hard, but
it was much harder. And it made me more self-conscious. Even after the discussion, I still now am very self-conscious about, am I being my authentic self? How am I presenting? Am I really, truly being who I am? So there's kind of that constant struggle with, okay, keeping some of the mask up, because you can't just all of a sudden, hey, mask off. This is going to be me, right?
Yeah.
But also trying to balance that with who I really am.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that. And I'll be on my Instagram later for folks who want to continue the conversation or who want to, DM me, because sometimes this is hard to talk about in front of other folks. So I'm happy to have these conversations. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining. And thank you, Diversity and Diabetes, for having us all together.
Yes, this has been great. Thank you so much. Y'all take care.